Evening. Welcome to the Mob Museum. My name is Jeff Schumacher. I'm the Vice President of Exhibits and Programs here. Thank you to everybody who's come out tonight to the museum. Such a nice night. You could easily be, walking outside somewhere, but appreciate you coming down here. I think you'll find that you made a great decision. Some of you have been attending our public programs for many years, and you know that we've covered a vast range of subjects, of topics, and we brought in speakers from all walks of life. That said, I don't think we've ever had anybody quite like Alan Geik. And I mean that in a good way, a good way. Alan is the author of Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz, The Jewish Mob, A Family Affair. The book is both a work of memoir and history. What sets it apart from so many other books about the mob is that Alan personally knew a lot of people who show up on the walls of this museum. Alan was not a mobster, at least he tells me he was not a mobster. But some of the men who were seated around his family dinner table were. They were just uncles and family friends to him at the time, but the things they did after dinner generated some of the biggest headlines of the 20th century. Alan is able to put a human face on individuals who most of us know only through police mugshots. Before we bring Alan up, I want to mention that after his talk, we will take questions from the audience, and we usually bring around a microphone so everybody can hear on the live stream, because this is being live streamed around the world, so everybody can hear your questions. So we'll bring a microphone around. And then after the Q&A, we'll do a book signing. And I highly recommend this book. This is what it looks like if you haven't gotten one yet. See if I can display this properly. And I hope you have the chance to take home a signed copy. So, all right, so let's please welcome Alan Geik to the front.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Well, let me just get that. I never really thought about writing this book for my whole life, and that's the book up there. And I was talking to my cousin a few years ago. He called, he was ecstatic, he was overjoyed. He said, "You have to go to this website." And I went there, and there was a photo of three men in a police lineup, 1930s, black and white. We've seen them before. And I said, "Okay, so what?" And he said, "No, that's my father on the right." And I looked carefully, and sure enough, it was Uncle Saul. And I said, "Okay." And it was way before I knew him. I didn't know him for another 20 years. And he said, "No, you see, it's my father. It's not Uncle George. It's not Uncle Charlie. It's not any of the other people." And he was so ecstatic, and I understood why, because Uncle Saul was a very small-time criminal. He would be arrested, and he had a huge rap sheet for stolen property and bad checks and things like that. Nobody was ever going to make a movie about him or write a book, and he wouldn't be on the walls here at the Mob Museum. But to my cousin, he was thrilled because it wasn't any of the other people, but his father, who was on the homepage of this website. And we laughed about it, and a few weeks later, I went to see my sister, who's over there, and I told her the story, and she said, I have all these photos, and I hadn't seen any of the family photos in 20 or 30 years, and she brought them out, and as I went through them, there were all the characters I remembered from our childhood, and she said, and I took them out and put them on the side, and she said, "I also have this book," and she gave it to me. It was a big, thick book called Mafia. It was put out by the U.S. Treasury Department in 1980, and each page was dedicated to a different organized crime figure. And I looked through the book, and sure enough, the people in the Mafia book were the same as the people's whose pictures I just took out. At least the people whose photos I had for my sister, each had their own dedicated page in the Mafia book. And that really brought to life the conversations that I remember that was so indelible, the accounts that those people gave us under so many different circumstances. And when I say we, I'm thinking about our brother also, our late brother, who was a police detective in New York. And oddly enough, he was given more credibility, or he was just treated better than we were, because all the criminals at that time saw the police as allies. At least you could always bribe them and get away with whatever you needed. So my brother got stories that probably I or my sister or even our parents wouldn't get. But so I sat down and I thought about writing, and the first issue that came up to me was, how do you write about these people? Because how do you write that you're not condoning what they did? If you portray them in a endearing moment, is that condoning what they did? There was a very fine line, because these were family people. These were people who I loved in many ways. I knew their children. We grew up with their children. So I didn't want it to seem as if I was condoning anything. And we had a good model for that, because our mother, who wasn't really in that world, she was always she set up really great guide rails for us, that there was a certain degree of interaction with these people. It wasn't like we could take a job in an office for an illegal gambling operation, which someone once offered me, and it was a war with my mother. Soon after that, I was about 17 years old. So that became an issue, but she always kept us away from the fire, away from the wanting to be part of that world, which a lot of other people did, and that we knew that that was definitely something we couldn't do. And when I first opened the page to start writing, and there's the blank Word document page, the words I put at the top of it were, Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz. And 60,000 words later, and a few years later, everything had been changed around. Every paragraph had been deleted and rewritten, and 65 photos were moved all around. The only thing that remained at the end of that whole journey of writing was Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz. And I realized that it came from my brother and my father, an interaction that we had had. And when we were young, when we were teenagers, and we had heard of Uncle Charlie, he was in prison, and he was a 25-year-old brash, first call hitman for Murder Incorporated, and he goes in to a tavern in New Jersey with his partner, Mendy Weiss, and they shoot and they kill Dutch Schultz and his three partners, who were all armed, and fired back at them. And then Uncle Charlie goes through Dutch Schultz's pockets and takes $8,000 out, and he goes out, and the getaway car is gone, so he walks all the way from Newark, New Jersey, back to New York. And the man we came to know later on was a man who was 35 years older than us, had some medical issues, had spent 23 years in prison, and was very much afraid of the probation department, parole department, which I'll mention a little later. So he was this very vulnerable man, and not the one that we had grown up thinking about. And my brother said, did Uncle Charlie really kill Dutch Schultz? And it was sort of a little joke with us. And when we mentioned it to our father, the first thing he said was, anyone who misjudges Charlie would be in a world of trouble. And he went on to explain a few things, and he really schooled us in a little bit of humility. We were in our mid-20s at the time, and we were sort of thinking that this man was no longer capable. He was probably in his mid-50s at the time. And now when I look back and say, wow, what people think about me, who are 30 years younger than me. So when I didn't have I couldn't really put a lot of him in the book because he had spent those 23 years in jail, and so many of the other characters had been out. So the book title sort of became a metaphor for that whole generation of older men whose exploits we had heard about and were long gone, but they themselves were still very viable human beings and very capable of whatever they did earlier in their life. And I'd just like to take a minute and go through the photos and talk about them a little bit. And this is Uncle Charlie Workman when he was arrested in 1941 for the 1935 murder of Dutch Schultz. I think you could see the date on the bottom of that. And Murder Incorporated came to an abrupt ending just 2 months before this photo was taken, and the other hitmen had informed on each other, and everybody was rounded up. They were taken into court, and it wasn't like today. They were charged and brought before juries, convicted, and they were given the death sentence, and the death sentences were carried out rather quickly. So Uncle Charlie pled no contest, and he was given a life sentence instead. And on a personal level, he had grown up with my parents and all the other people in the book, and my father, when Charlie was in prison, he was one of the many people who brought money to the family. My father was, as they would say, a civilian. He had no police record ever in his life. So he brought money to Charlie. And Charlie, when he got out of prison, he was really appreciative that my father was one of those people, because he always worried about his family when he was in prison. And my brother, who was a detective and not always on the straight and narrow back then, which I'll probably get to a little later, he was later arrested in the mid-'70s in a big police scandal. But when Charlie got out, he was concerned that being he had a reputation, he would be in the crosshairs of a parole officer who might want to try to get him back in prison. And my brother always said to him, listen, we can talk to whatever parole officer you get. We have a lot of sway with the parole office, and don't worry about it. Charlie, I think when he was really relieved about that. And he always referred to my brother and me as his nephews, and I could never have imagined calling him anything but Uncle Charlie. And this is Uncle Charlie when he was released in 1964 on my sister's birthday, March 10th. And my sister was just about going into college at the time. And we met him a few weeks later for the first time. And we met in a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown, because he always, when he got out of prison, he didn't want to go to places where people would know him. So he always said, nobody's going to know me in Chinatown, so we'll go to Chinatown. And he also said, when he was in prison, what he missed most was his family, and next to that, it was Chinese food. So, but I had a very poignant recollection that one of many, and I'll share that. When he got out of prison, one of the prime jobs for people in prison who were connected to the mob was at the Coliseum right near Columbus Circle. It's no longer there. It was a big convention center. And to get in, you needed to get a job in the stagehands union. You really needed some pull. And Charlie got a job there when he came out. And a few years later, I happened to go up to my father's trucking company, and Charlie was sitting there, and he said to me, what have you been doing? And I said, well, I'm trying to get in the cameraman's union, but it's a tough grind. And he said, he made a phone call, and he said, let's go up to the Coliseum. So he took my father and I up to the Coliseum to see the head of the stagehands union, whose name was Johnny McNamee, who got indicted a few years later for labor racketeering. And Charlie said, this is my nephew, Alan, and I'd like to if we can get him in here for a few months, maybe we could switch him over, find a way to get him into the cameraman's local. And Johnny shot it down with a few reasons, and one was a little embarrassing to me. And we got back in the car, in the cab going back downtown, and Charlie slapped me on my knee, and he said, "You know, Alan, before I went to prison, if I wanted anything from a union official, I just opened their window and said, 'It's a long way down.'" And we all laughed. My father and I laughed when we heard that. It was one of those jokes that they would tell at that time. But I also felt a real disappointment that he couldn't take care of me the way my brother and my father took care of him. And it was one of my lasting memories of Uncle Charlie. And these two men, their crime careers had the same trajectory as organized crime in the 20th century. And they went through Prohibition together, the Depression, World War II, and the post-war era. And they grew and prospered the same way as organized crime did. And they were the most successful men in my family organized crime culture. And the man on the left, his name was George Geik, and he changed it to George Gordon. And on the right, his lifelong friend was Reuben Koloditsky, who changed his name to Ruby Kolod. And they spent their whole life involved in various criminal enterprises, but it specifically relates to Las Vegas. And I started the book off and followed them throughout the book because I always came back to them because they were just blossoming in this crime world. And I started the book off with them climbing through the alleyway window into a dry goods store where they had been during the day, and they had seen the owner take out a tin box, and there was some bills in it, so they climbed through the window. It was the first time they ever did a burglary. They were 12 or 13 years old, and they had done street crimes, but this was a step up for them. They climbed through the window, and they took out $40 out of the tin box. And they also took 2 candlesticks with them, and they gave it to one of their young other gang members, whose name was Johnny Eda, who would play a great part in my book. And he became one of the biggest fences on the East Coast and very much part of this crime culture that I remember so fondly. But once they saw the $40, they were hooked, and they knew they were going to be criminals for the rest of their life. And when they were 18, they wound up getting great jobs with a man named Trigger Mike Coppola, who was by then moving up in the Italian underworld, and he had a casino on the west side of Manhattan, a casino speakeasy, and they wound up managing it for a short while until they got in trouble with both the mob and the police. And Trigger Mike said, "You guys have to get out of town." So he sent them to, of all places, Cleveland. And they go to Cleveland, and these had to be the 2 luckiest fugitives in the world, because they get to Cleveland, and a man named Mo Dalitz, who became the godfather of Las Vegas and a great civic leader, he was building out illegal casinos throughout the Cleveland area. And these weren't just casinos that were roadside, in the back of a roadside bar or something like that. These were like standalone buildings with driveways and fine dining and the first-rate entertainment. They were all being protected by the local police. This was wide open. And so Uncle George and Ruby go, and they become managers of these casinos over the next 20 years. And of course, the casinos attract their generation of gangsters and gamblers, so they made contact with all these people. And then it all comes to an end about 1950, and they get run out of Ohio, but Mo Dalitz is a step ahead, and he buys into the Desert Inn and later the Stardust. And this was the second greatest stroke of luck, especially for Uncle George, because the Nevada Gaming Commission put out a blacklist, and they banned certain gangsters and gamblers from entering the casino. And two of the people whose names they put down on the list were Trigger Mike Coppola, who was Uncle George's mentor, and a younger gangster named Sam Giancana from Chicago. And both of them couldn't come into the casinos, and they were so close to Uncle George, they picked him out as being their eyes and ears in the counting rooms. And it worked out for everybody, for the Cleveland mob, Modowitz, and those people, because they didn't have to worry about these gangsters from out of town thinking they were getting the short end of the skim. So a newspaper in Chicago, the Chicago Sun-Times, did a story on skimming in Las Vegas, and they pointed out that it was Uncle George, and they went through it in great length, Uncle George and Sam Giancana and some of the other people, and they were pulling out $50,000 a month apiece, according to the article. And the article was quoted in a Senate hearing in 1966 about a crime and skimming in Las Vegas, and I think they came to the conclusion was, yes, there is skimming in Las Vegas, and that was the end of it. But here was Uncle George, who had climbed through the window of this back alley window when he was 12 years old to get $40 out. And here he was making $50,000 a month, according to the newspaper report, and he had come a long way. But what about his partner, Ruby Kolod, who had spent all those years with him? Well, Ruby becomes the president of the Desert Inn. And he's the guy, little Ruby climbing through that window is now the guy who tells Howard Hughes's people, you got to leave. They had come into the Desert Inn, and they rented two floors of suites. And they wanted him out because they saw the Howard Hughes people as deadbeats. They didn't gamble, they didn't drink. They wanted those suites for high rollers. And so Howard Hughes turns around and he buys the Desert Inn, and he buys 5 or 6 other casinos in town. But he made the big mistake of leaving the people who were doing all the skimming in the counting room to still count the money. In all of these places, so in the Desert Inn and the Stardust, there were Uncle George and all these people still taking the money out, except now they were taking it out from Howard Hughes, and he winds up losing a lot of money, and there's various accounts of that, and he leaves town 2 years later, and the rest is history. And one of the best interpreters of organized crime for us was a man named Sammy Cass. His name was Cassup, and he had been a top guy. He had a long criminal record, and it went back into Prohibition days. And he had been a top gun for a Prohibition boss whose name was Waxy Gordon, and he became legendary and to the people who really follow the names of all the gangsters of that era. And Sammy Cass, to my brother and my sister and me, he was the most hardened criminal of all, and he had great insight into the working of Murder Incorporated, and he would tell it in the first person. And it was like, am I really hearing this? And he was one of our best sources, and I recalled many of the conversations we had had with him as I wrote this book. And in this photo, Waxy Gordon is on the left, and he looks particularly forlorn because he knows this is a 1951 DEA sting, and it was one of the biggest arrests of that year in New York City. And Waxy Gordon's on the left. He knows it's the end of the line, and he was going to die 2 years later in prison. And the man standing next to him was the getaway driver. His name was Arthur Coppola, and he would be assassinated in a mob hit about 16 years later. And there's Sammy Cass in that nice, fashionable, light-colored suit, and he was going to be getting a 15-year prison sentence. And the man on the right, in some ways, holding his head in shame, was Sammy's younger brother, Benny, who became really a loving character in our life. He got a 5-year prison sentence, and he went to Sing Sing, and my mother was often upset that Sammy brought him along because she didn't really see Benny as the hardened criminal she knew Sammy was. But with every mob story, there's also a love interest. And the picture of Benny Cohen holding his hand over his face. Here is Benny in the back seat with his girlfriend at the time. Her name was Sylvia Lorber, and she happened to be my mother's best friend since high school days. My mother and my father were in the front seat in that arcade car, and as soon as Benny went to prison, Sylvia picked up with another well-known mob figure, another Murder Incorporated guy who was Sammy's partner, and this man's name was Red Levine. And Red Levine had an interesting place in this history because he was unique in that he was a religious Jew. He was observant, that they said. He wore a yarmulke under his fedora, but he was a cold-blooded killer, and he was considered a very close friend of Lucky Luciano, and that gave him a lot of respect in the Italian crime world. But he was also I found him to be really of great interest more recently, and this came up as I was writing the book. I went on to the internet, and I saw all these organized crime groups, and there was a picture of Red Levine, and I wrote something like, oh yeah, I knew Red Levine. I used to go to his bar on the Lower East Side when I was 10 years old and watch the baseball game. And I got about 20 people who wrote back to me, you knew Red Levine, and it seemed so weird to me because people who were much younger than me were writing about a man who died 50 years ago, and they wanted every bit of information about him. And when Red was with Sylvia, they had a very contentious relationship for 20 years, and Sylvia, as often happens in domestic disputes, she would tell my mother and my sister, who's over there, and they were listening to these salacious stories while I was hearing the men's story in the bars about who was indicted for mail fraud. So I think I sort of lost out on it, but someone would write, what's your best memory of Red Levine? And I said, well, the best memory was that he and Sylvia had a fight in front of Macy's on 34th Street, and she got away. She got into a taxi and drove away, and I never thought that that was what they had in mind, but it was my favorite memory of that story for some reason. And I put this one up. After Sammy got out of prison, he did 15 years, he wound up being the right-hand man or the lieutenant to one of the crime figures in New York whose name was Fat Tony Salerno. And they were inseparable, and he was like the only Jewish lieutenant that Fat Tony had, and Fat Tony often made a joke of that. But here was my mother and Sam, and they were at a family event. And Sam, at this age, this was the time when he was so free with telling the stories of his life that was really indelible to all of us. And at the end, Sammy and Fat Tony gave my parents their 50th wedding anniversary in, of course, the Copacabana, which was a mob casino, a mob nightclub in New York. Let me take some water just for a second. I'm not used to talking this much, although my wife would say that's not true. go. I mentioned earlier Johnny Eda, who took the silver holders, the silver candle holders, and he had worked for a pawn shop at the time. And as soon as he was about 18, he found his way into City Hall, the corrupt City Hall of Mayor Jimmy Walker in the last days of Prohibition. And he really networked within City Hall. He was buying stolen jewelry from city officials and selling jewelry to them. And he would be doing that for the next 20 years. But he, in addition to being very close friends with my parents and with us for his whole life, he was unique in organized crime. He was the only one I wrote about who wasn't violent, and he often wore an ascot. He's not right now. And he went to museums, and he read art books, and when he was in prison, he learned Spanish, and I spoke it to him, and he was rather fluent in it. And he also learned the saxophone while he was in jail. And I asked him one time, he said he was in the prison orchestra, the prison band in Atlanta. And I said, do you go on tour? And he, and he was also greatly respected in the organized crime world because he had such an inroad with all these corrupt officials through the Depression and World War II and even after that people like Frank Costello and Vito Genovese would ask him to see if he could pay off someone under different circumstances, especially if those people were Jewish. They would use Johnny Eda to be their front to pay someone off. One day, in the mid-'80s, I was in L.A. working, and he came to L.A. and he asked me what I was working on, and I was at Paramount Pictures, and I was working on a movie called Daniel, which was directed by Sidney Lumet, and it was the story of the children of the Rosenbergs, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were executed for being spies about 1951. And I was so outraged as I was talking to him. I said, you know, that Judge Kaufman, he gave a death sentence to the only people that ever got executed for being spies with these two Jews, and he gave them, and I went on and on about how he was the fall guy for the FBI who were anti-Semites and all of this stuff. And Johnny listened patiently, and when I came to the end, he said, you know what always bothered me about that case, Alan? 2 weeks before the case started, Vito Genovese gave me $25,000 to give to Judge Kaufman to get two of his guys off. And I said, oh my God, yeah, thank you. That really makes me feel even better about Judge Kaufman. But they said it in such a matter-of-fact way that's what they did. And I always remember Johnny for that particular comment. And in the picture, which was interesting, how would I have ever gotten a picture, or however who took it? There's Johnny showing off some of his merchandise to my sister, and they're just praising the jewelry. And whenever he wanted to bring something to show us, he always said, oh, this is from my late wife's collection. And we always knew that it was bull because he just wanted to keep us away from the flame of crime. And oh yes, this one here. This picture I remember from my childhood, and I found it in my sister's photo albums, and it really spoke to organized crime. If I had to find a picture of organized crime in the mid-20th century, that would be a candidate. And I knew three of the people in the picture from my whole life, but I couldn't place the other men. And on the left, sitting in the closest to the camera, is a man named Tommy Diaguardi, and next to him is his brother Johnny Diaguardi, and they were like these very powerful mafia labor racketeers at that time. And Johnny Eda was in charge of he ran the Teamsters Union out of Idlewild Airport, and it was so crucial to a truck movement in New York City that he really was able to control a lot of the business in the city. And I didn't know who the rest of the men, except the man in the foreground on the right, is my father. And he's sitting there, and he was always, we always considered him organized crime adjacent. And he was, and he's sitting there, but I didn't know who the other men were, but the third man on the right with the glasses and the round face, he looked like I had seen him in a picture of, with my uncle in Cleveland, my Uncle George, and he just looked like that. And I went on to Facebook, and I found a few organized crime groups, and I went to a Cleveland group, and I said, does anyone know who these people are besides these three people I identified? And no one answered. And when the book came out, so I wasn't able to identify them in the book. I left that go. But after the book was published, someone got in touch with me, and he said, oh, I bought your book, and you know, my uncle is sitting next to your father. And next to my uncle is my grandfather. And I said, oh, this is too crazy. What's your grandfather's name? And he told me, and I said, oh, your grandfather was the money launderer for the Cleveland mob. And because I remembered the name, even though I had never met him. And the picture made sense, because he said, oh, that picture was taken in 1947. I had thought it was much later. And he said, it was 1947, and in 1947, the Cleveland mob was taking money from the which I only found out later. I mean, I was only 5 years old, so I wasn't too into the technical stuff at the time. But they were taking money from the kickbacks from the Teamsters Union and investing it in other places, specifically in Havana, which the Cleveland mob had gone to 10 years earlier with Meyer Lansky. I wrote a fair amount about that, but there they were, in town, no doubt, to make a transfer of a lot of money into taking all this ill-gotten gains of the Teamsters Union and putting into Las Vegas. And at the same time, the same person said, oh, by the way, that other photo you have in there, and this is a photo, my father's in the middle, and Johnny Eda is on the left. And I couldn't identify the two women. I thought they were Johnny Eda's family. And he said, oh, that's my mother sitting on the right, and my grandmother is sitting next to her. And so that's how we dated the picture as of 1947, because he knew how old she was. And 20 years later, my father, who had been working as all those years, he had a job as in a shipping department. He was a manager of a shipping department for a music publishing company, and then the publishing company closed up, and he wound up working 20 years later for a small trucking company, trying to get involved in, they couldn't pick up from a manufacturer in the garment center because they didn't have the right connections. And somehow my father got involved, and he called Johnny Eda, and the next thing they were given the right to pick up the stuff. And this happened a few times, and then they said to my father, well, why don't you just become a partner with us? And so my father did, and the three partners were very successful for the rest of my father's life. And in the 1970s and 1980s, a lot of media attention in New York was given to mob control of entertainment venues, strip joints, bars, gay bars, all those kinds of nightclubs. And the man that they always identified as being the mob figure who was in charge of that, or who really ran it, was a man named Matty the Horse Ianello. And it was always interesting to me how the Jewish men and the Italian men formed alliances and kept them going for 30 and 40 years. And I wrote a lot about that because it fascinated me, even as I was a younger person. And this is a picture of all places at my bar mitzvah. And and Benny Cohn is sitting in the center in the back looking at the camera behind the woman who's turned to the camera. And standing on the far right is my father. And Benny Cohn and Mattie kept this business going for 30 years. And they owned 200 bars or financed 200 bars. They had pieces, as they would say, of the action of 200 bars throughout Manhattan. And they also owned one of the prized industries at the time, I don't know if it still is, was private garbage hauling. And there was turf wars over which mob controlled which bit of garbage hauling for private companies. And in the late 70s, I went up to see Benny, and Mattie was there, and he said to me, "Oh, we do the garbage hauling for Madison Square Garden. If you ever want tickets, call me up and I'll get you the best seats." He said, "I get better seats than the players' wives." And I told my brother, who by this point had left the police department, he had been arrested, and he never, as many of the police involved in that, they didn't give up any of the other people, so they were in good standing among the underworld in New York. And I told my brother the story, and he said, "Yeah, but the only thing you can't do is go up to the office on Monday, because on Monday, all the managers of the clubs come up with suitcases and attaché cases filled with cash, and the hallway is lined with detectives." He said, "I know, because I was one of those detectives for a long time." And he and Mattie and my brother became partners in a few businesses until they both passed. My brother passed away in 2008, and I think Mattie did around the same time. And Mattie was so close to my brother, he said, he tried to get my father in a joking kind of way. He said, "Why don't you retire and let Bernard take over?" They had a joke about it, and then finally my father said he was retiring, and Mattie said, "Well, I'm going to give you a retirement party in my," he had a first-class Italian restaurant called SPQR, and he had a private dining area, and so he gave a party for my father, and that's me in my John Travolta suit of the era, and my father having a drink, and his partner, Benny Cohn, couldn't come because Benny, by this point, was indicted on the usual menu of mob charges, the RICO Act, tax evasion, extortion, all of that, and he wound up doing a fair amount of time. But the joke that came out of it in our family, there were many jokes like that, the joke that came out was Mattie made Dad an offer he couldn't refuse. And so, okay. This photo I probably here on the walls of the museum, but it really spoke loudly to me. And one of the points I tried to make in the book was that these people lived in a different world. They lived in a different world from me, and certainly in the generation as they were growing up. They took life in a whole different way. There was no internet and social media and television and all that. And I couldn't really imagine putting myself back as an adult in that era, how it would have been. But this photo speaks loudly to that. These are two Murder Incorporated hitmen. The man on the left, his name was Louis Capone, and he was no relation to Al Capone. And on the right is Mendy Weiss, the guy who was Uncle Charlie's partner in the Dutch Schultz killing. And just a few days before this photo was taken, they had been convicted in a New York court of murdering a Brooklyn shop owner, a candy store owner. And they were convicted, and sentenced to the electric chair in Sing Sing, and their sentence was to be carried out 1 month later. And so here they are on the train going up to Sing Sing to be executed, and they have no handcuffs on, they have no shackles, no orange jumpsuits, no police in SWAT uniforms with automatic weapons. They just have the New York Times folded over their laps and a smile for the camera. And that spoke to me of, that's really gangster stuff. And the photo was taken 4 days before Pearl Harbor. And they weren't executed a month later. It took 2 or 3 years, and they were executed because a crime boss who was convicted with them had some legal challenges, but the legal challenges certainly didn't go 20 and 30 years as they do now. And I'd like to end the presentation with a sort of a family joke that's gone on for some time, especially now my sister and I keep it going. And this is a famous photo. It's of Meyer Lansky in 1958, and it's from the Library of Congress. And he was arrested for vagrancy at that time, and it was sort of a joke that this mob boss would be arrested for vagrancy, but that was a harassment charge at the time, and he was ultimately dismissed a few months, the charge was dismissed, but a few months before that or after that, my father called me up and he asked me to meet him in Uncle George's suite, and Uncle George stayed in the Essex House, which to me and to our family was really elegant. It was on the south side of Central Park, and we lived 5 of us in a 2-bedroom apartment, and to go to the Essex House was a big deal for all of us, and we could always order anything we wanted for room service. Nobody cared. So I went up to the suite, and the room had men in it smoking cigars and cigarette and drinking booze, and my father called me over. There was a man sitting at the window, and he had an open shirt, and I knew it was Meyer Lansky. And he introduced me, and Meyer Lansky said to me after a little bit of small talk, "Do you want a pastrami sandwich?" Now, I was really shocked, the last thing I would have heard, and it wasn't that big of a deal because, again, it was a different time, and social media made everybody so much bigger. I mean, he was accessible in a lot of ways, and I said no, and he said, let's share one. Half of it is enough, and he leaned forward and he said, Pastrami killed more Jews than Hitler. Now, when I heard that, I just broke up laughing, and I had never heard that before. My sister since has told me that that was sort of a joke in every Jewish comedian's book of jokes, but I had never heard it. But when he saw my reaction, I think or maybe I'm reading into it, but he was smiled, and he thought it was, my laugh wasn't the laugh of a sycophant or one of his yes men. And so I saw appreciation on his face, and he called someone over, and then he said, go down to the stage delicatessen and pick up whatever it was, 4 or 5 sandwiches, and don't use my name, use so-and-so's name. And that was the end of the story, except that it had some life to it, because for years after that, every so often, if I wanted to be a total idiot, if my sister would say, oh, I'm graduating from Hunter College next week, or my brother said, here's my gold badge, I'm a detective, I say, yeah, but I shared a pastrami sandwich with Meyer Lansky. And thank you.
All right, so lots of stories. There's many more where that came from, too, in the book. Want to take a few questions, hopefully, from the audience. And so if you could raise your hand, we'll have a microphone brought around. Okay, we start over here.
Hi. Yeah, where did you grow up? Where did you live during this time? I mean, I'm from New York City also. So
I grew up in the Bronx. on 170th Street in the Bronx, and I lived there through college years in various parts of the Bronx, and then I lived in Lower Manhattan for a long time by the Brooklyn Bridge.
When you say 170th Street, like the Grand Concourse?
Exactly on the Grand Concourse.
Because I'm from the Fordham Road area, so
Where?
183rd Street.
Oh, yeah, I know that. That's by Poe Park, then?
Yeah,
Okay.
okay. I'm just curious.
Yeah, sure.
All right, do we have another question? There's another one. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm from Brooklyn. Did Lansky have bodyguards with him when he traveled?
Sorry?
Did Lansky have bodyguards with him when he traveled?
It's a good question. I really can't answer that because what I understood later on was that Meyer Lansky, at that time, he had his own apartment at the Essex House, and that's probably why my uncle stayed there when he came in. And he was sort of maybe visiting from across the hall. But I can't say if any of the men in that suite, I'm guessing they weren't, that none of them were, none of them were bodyguards.
Well, we have one in the middle, but I'm going to ask one while we're working our way there. Alan, your dad, you called your dad mob adjacent. Did you ever have a chance to talk to him about that and the whole mob thing?
Oh, absolutely. So, they grew up in an environment where all of these men, Uncle George, who was the most successful, and Charlie and Sammy Cass, they grew up in, when we grew up, we didn't really see them just as criminals because they were part of a family, and it was hard for me to write and not appear that I was condoning anything. But my father often spoke about it. He would tell stories about them, but in his whole life, he was never arrested, and he did these kinds of sensitive things for Uncle George. And I remember one time my father came home with a shopping bag. It was filled with cash. I mean, the rent in our apartment was $78 a month, or $70 a month, and there was thousands of dollars, and it turned out that he was in a bar drinking with Uncle George, who had it next to him, and George was too drunk, so he gave it to my father, and he brought it up to our house, and there was I think he at one point said it was $35,000, which was, my father may have made a few $1,000s a week at the time, but he had those kinds of functions.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering whether there were any women who were involved in the mob.
Well, my sister who's here is thinking of writing about that because there weren't women that I was related that were in the mob, but the women who were related to the men had a really interesting story. In a lot of ways, it was more interesting than the men's story because a man would go to jail for a few years and the woman would be home struggling with the kids and getting paid some money. And then the man would come out and find a girlfriend would be the first thing he would do. So there was all that kind of poignant factors to their lives. And my sister actually had the opportunity to interview them and write the interviews down. And so hopefully she'll put that into writing one of these days. But I can't say any of them were really active in the business end of it.
You take one or two more? Anybody? Oh, over here. We got a couple. Hold on a second. We'll bring the microphone to you.
Can I?
Thank you very much.
Hi.
Hi. Did anyone ever express any remorse or shame for what they did?
No. But let me, no, I was asked that question before, and I could say they treated their lives, that's what it was. There was a lot of factors going on, because when they were growing up, they were the first generation of Jewish men who were fighting in the streets, not just the Nazis who later on would walk the street, but this was a daily occurrence, and so there were a lot of people who gave them a lot of leeway and said, well, they had to be an organized crime. But to my family, that was really never true. And to them also, they knew that they had other lives they could have led, but to them it was, this is what we did, and we'll we'll stand by it.
I think, did we have another question? Hold on a second, we'll bring it around.
Hi, thank you. Can I just ask you, could you possibly tell me, did you or any of your family, outside of obviously living here now, did you have any connection to Las Vegas prior to when you moved here?
Our immediate family, Uncle George, of course, did, and his family lived here, and my sister visited sometimes. But before I came here 10 years ago, I had been here once or twice from Los Angeles. Is that answering your question?
So you never went to go visit Uncle Ruby at the DI?
But one of the things that you pointed out, Alan, is that your Uncle George was actually pretty involved in Las Vegas.
Yes,
And so that's something we don't know a lot about, at least I don't know a lot about, and I want to look into that and learn more about that for the museum. So we're gonna do some deep dive on that.
And actually, there was a Senate hearing that I mentioned that took place about 1966. It was Senator Church was his name, and he was investigating skim in Las Vegas. And they had a lot of information and contemporary professors at the time who had studied those few years. And if you want, I can get you those. The references are in the book, by the way.
Very good. Well, thank you all very much. And don't forget, we're going to have a book signing right over to the left here. Hopefully you'll get a copy of the book, and we'll have it signed and everything. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you.